There exists in rural European American communities an undisclosed subtext about who they really are. It's hinted at in songs and movies, but never explicitly said. Their good old days were our Jim Crow. The draw of these rural communities is more than Crackle Barrel, Friday Night Lights, sweet tea, and country music. It's Christian nationalism and Jim Crow with lipstick on. They're constantly hearkening back to a simpler time, which subtext means prior to the Civil Rights Act. The mint juleps and cornbread are not as sweet when the hands that harvested the crops and wrote the recipe and served them had no free will. It is this exact absence of free will for Black people that made Europeans so at ease and comfortable living in the past. They purport to champion family values, hardworking people. The antagonists in all of their quaint, etched out rural existences are the city slickers, a euphemism for Yankees. Their bitterness towards the North, even 5 generations after the War of Northern Aggression, is still palpable. Scrubbed from the charmed depictions of wholesome pastoral life are Jim Crow, the Reconstruction era homophobia and Islamophobia, and a general disdain for anyone who is not white, straight, cis, and Christian. Small towns are always described as safe, locals often boasting no one locks their doors, implying that small town people are the creme of the crop and shining exemplaries of good citizens. Ironically, this security and peace of mind was not granted for Black and Indigenous people in sundown towns. White adults in these communities have very little to recollect about the civil rights movement, at least publicly. They will go on a diatribe about the warm and fuzzy feeling the small town gives them and what a wonderful time for them their childhood was, but surprisingly, they do not care to address racism, a culture of intimidation and antagonism directed at Black communities. Their ignorance of white Southerners is generic in these cases. They have a very hard time hiding their animosity towards Black folks, who to them are barely human. And when confronted about this long history of lynchings in sundown towns, they deflect, deny, or victim blame. If you were to peel back the facade of George Jones, there's George Wallace. These picturesque small towns are sundown towns. In 150 years, their attitudes towards Black people have little changed. Southern hospitality, or this idea that Southerners are brimming with goodwill and warm intentions towards strangers, works well as a tourist trap. But it's hard to see the hospitality in the forced labor camps that dot the southern U.S. So much so has the Southern image been rehabilitated to the point to which people will get married and host joyous occasions at these work camps. They enjoy the detailed architecture, frolic in the gardens, which were built and managed by slaves, and with zero recognition of the crimes against humanity as they host wedding receptions. And the years of forced labor beatings, rapes, and kidnappings of children from their parents should be at the forefront of any tour or discussion on plantations. But their labor as well as their stories are effectively scrubbed from the record, whitewashed for tourists or newlyweds. Nothing more than a soothing backdrop or a pit stop for ahistorical HGTV enthusiasts. If you were to turn on any true country station, Hallmark movie, or CMT show, they all lean heavily on the identity of the downtrodden farmer trying to eke out an existence, who is a family man, fears God, and loves his country. His path is obstructed by the government, big city folk, and Yankees, who now more recently are called the woke. His identity is constantly under attack by more modern progressive forces. Country music has an infatuation with the past, but refuses to reconcile with their long and detailed history of racial violence. They will show a downtown 1930s ice cream parlor, but edit out the whites only sign, or will talk about how they were born and bred in a small town for generations but plead ignorance of ever participating in a lynching or intimidating Black people. They will cherry pick the parts of history that they are comfortable with and highlight them in songs and movies, but are eerily quiet when it comes to the violence perpetuated by their grandparents. White Southerners are the most unreliable narrators when it comes to retelling their story of the South. They won't mention the Reconstruction era, they won't mention Jim Crow, and they won't be forthcoming about just how tolerated and commonplace racism was in their own home. Up until the 1900s, postcards were sold depicting lynchings. So to feign unfamiliarity or to flat out deny how commonplace it was is a concerted effort to lie to cover their tracks. Compare a Black individual's account of the South to a white person's, and you may think they came from other sides of the world. To plead ignorance and deny participating in one of America's bloodiest periods is not just ahistorical but dangerous. My family members haven't forgotten, so I doubt yours have. The Southern hospitality they boast about was not evident in Black communities, or else there would not have been a great migration of Black families fleeing the reign of the local white terrorists. This artificial plight would have you believe that these John Wayne wannabes face discrimination at every corner, constant victims of an unjust world, outcast and treated as underclass citizens, all themes in the actual plight of African Americans and Indigenous people. But this retelling centers the European American. This kind of myth-making essentially creates a victim out of the European yeoman who, ironically, would be burning crosses on Black families' lawns or protesting against desegregation. We must dismiss this artificial archetype of the humble yeoman who was persecuted by the state. Just as they were able to fall back on free Black labor from slaves, today they are provided with the exact same form of a safety net or government assistance that they purport to despise due to pride. Whereas Black farmers, we were never afforded the same leniency or soft landing. The redneck has subsidies. He has grants, banks that will loan him money, and other forms of government aid that makes him a welfare queen. The agricultural industry that they point to as a manifestation of their hard work was first a result of slavery, then sharecropping, and now migrant workers. Their profits, the lush plantations and bustling markets, disregard the unpaid labor from Black and Latino communities, paying them barely enough to feed themselves, in turn making them completely reliant on landowners. No paid maternity leave, nor vacations, or even basic health care. This form of serfdom shackled Black farmers after the Emancipation Proclamation, and to this day, they continue this exploitative agricultural model by seeking to hire only the most disenfranchised and vulnerable members of society. Now, for the European Americans too poor to own slaves or did not own land, they did not explicitly benefit from slavery and its aftermath, but even the lowest wage earners in factories and mines earned more than their Black co-workers for the same amount of labor, in turn profiting from dividing the working class, which aided them in acquiring generational wealth, sending kids to school, or invest in their own enterprises and trade. This would motivate them to participate in lynchings and other forms of violent terrorism. Even well past the end of chattel slavery, there were well-respected members of the community who participated in the killing of Black people for sport and harvesting human remains like hunting trophies. This tradition continues through harsh policing policies on the Black community, and more specifically in Laurel, Mississippi. The branding of the all-American, football-loving, God-fearing, small-town dweller resonates so strongly with European Americans that celebrities from Taylor Swift to George Bush have latched onto it. imitating a southern drawl or pull from picturesque pastoralism. Taylor Swift hails from Pennsylvania, George Bush, Connecticut, but through their contrived regional accents and blue jean working class cosplay, they have been able to profit off of rural nostalgia, otherwise considered Yankees. Everyone from celebrities to politicians latch on to small town nostalgia to market to rural European Americans. To them, any act of violence against a Black person is only self-defense and was provoked. This mixed with the 20th century eugenics have European American Southerners hunting Black people because without their boot on the Black community's neck, the white race would be doomed. Aside from exploiting our labor, the only other voluntary European Americans Southerners have with Black people was when they're antagonizing us, which was a sick form of entertainment for them. They could assault Black women, brutalize Black men, and create as many Black orphans as they wanted as a form of stress release. When I listen to my parents, my grandparents, and other members of my community recount their experiences with Jim Crow and share their stories of how they were treated, and then see strangers who are too invested in white supremacy to listen confidently call them overdramatic crybabies, it tells me that they are incapable of feeling remorse for their community's actions. Selectively choosing which parts of history to highlight and bring to the forefront, i.e. the Founding Fathers, Constitution, Tea Party, colony fetishization, and ignoring the lack of morals and human rights violations, this is done by neutering historical landmarks such as plantations, building over cemeteries, repurposing slave markets. In this way, white Southerners are plastering over Black Americans' history with a more pleasant, romanticized recollection of slavery. If you talk to another European Southerner enough, the justifications for slavery come out, i.e. we were dumb brutes who were given purpose on plantations with no higher aspirations than manual labor, that we sent our compatriots from Africa, ergo somehow responsible for our own station, or that it was just not that bad because we were seen as a long-term investment, all of which are false, callous, and racist knee-jerk justifications. In a country where postcards are sold up until the 20th century depicting lynchings as well as dissected human body parts from Black civilians out like party favors, there has been a deliberate and concerted effort to censor European Americans' crimes against humanity against my people. And still to this day, in places like Laurel, Mississippi, they hunt Black people like sport, reliving their mischances to be slave catchers or policemen.